Thank you, Dr. Garrison, and thank you, President Vargas. Thanks to Kutztown for hosting what I think is a timely and important discussion to be had on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Moynihan Report. I can't believe it's been 50 years. That seems a little insane. But what's interesting is I think you'll find over the course of the day that the topics connected to the Moynihan Report, the issues that we'll be wrestling with on this panel, on panels later on and throughout the day, are actually quite relevant to issues and things that we're thinking about and talking about today. I'm joined this morning by a panel of experts who are going to help us to set the stage and provide some historical context for the original release of the report in 1965. On the far side of the stage here, I have Mr. Louis Day, who is a graduate student here in public administration. Mr. Day, can you just raise your hand so people can see who you are? Sitting right next to him is Professor Louis Rodriquez, who is in the history department here at Kutztown. Professor Rodriquez, would you mind raising your hand for us? There you go, thank you. And immediately here to my left is Dr. Tonya Thames-Taylor, who is a historian at Westchester University. So this is a nice sort of Lehigh, Kutztown, Westchester regional panel of folks to discuss these issues. And I kind of want to start with the question, and this, you might be too young for this, sir, but I kind of want to start with a question that's about your first encounter with the report, which is can you talk a little bit about the context in which you first heard about the report, or the first time you read about it? And obviously that's going to give us a full range. Maybe you're doing it through research, maybe you heard about the report when it was initially released, but I wonder if you guys could talk to the audience about what your first experience was with the Moynihan Report.
Okay, my experience.
Is your mic? Yeah. Okay.
My experience is. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. And so my experience was at actually my undergraduate. I went to school in Mississippi at Tougaloo College, and I was born after the Moynihan Report. In fact, I was the first generation of integrated Mississippi. I was born after 1970. And so what happens is at Tougaloo College, we had to read it in an African American history class. And imagine being 19 years old and reading the report. And I'm going to tell you, so the professor, William Woods, who was trained under this historian by the name of James McPherson at Princeton, he said, so what is your engagement with the document? And I looked at it and I said, well, you know, he was asking the class, and I said, I see really nothing wrong with this outside of the fact that seemingly the black woman is the center of this whole thesis. And it seems as if a person who is a victim is a perpetrator. And so for me, the Moynihan Report, along with some stories from my grandmother about Emmett Till, led me to go into my dissertation topic, which would be lynching, because I became fascinated with how a nation can make a victim a perpetrator of a pathology. And although, you know, Moynihan and Glaser, they do a job at explaining that this black woman was herself a phenomena, it was still, she was the crux of the tangle of pathology that that was the center of this discourse. And so that was my introduction.
So you're reading it in college, and you in the context of a classroom space, and you immediately sort of see that black women are in some ways demonized in the report. And for those of you not familiar with some of the broad sort of strokes of the report is released at a time where the U.S. government is thinking about kind of what are the next steps after the civil rights movement, what are the next steps to try to continue to make progress after the long sort of history of segregation and slavery in the United States. And Moynihan believed that the black family, in fact, that single black mothers would end up being the downfall of any sort of progress for black folks. So you felt that in your initial reading and your initial contact with it.
Yeah, because, and you have to understand the world that I was in. Again, I grew up 60 miles east of New Orleans, and I grew up in a beautiful world of women, black women on southern porches. and where we learned how to negotiate politics. They were domestics, they were former sharecroppers. So to read this report, and then also there was a movie that came out that I was familiar with. It came out early on, and I saw reruns of it, of a black woman. Her name was Claudine. And so, who was really like, when I read the report, I was thinking of a Claudine character, and this person was played by Diane Carroll. She had several kids. Her partner, if you will, was working on one of these low jobs. So when I was reading this report, because one thing about reading is that where's your connection point? So my connection point growing up in, the Gulfport, Mississippi, and in this beautiful world of women, I couldn't identify those women with the report, but I could identify a media and Claudine aspect with the report. And so I started to look at it, and in many ways, coming from Mississippi, and I was in Mississippi at the time, but it also sort of reinforced my understanding of urban America too. Because in this report, they really make a contrast between rural and urban. And so therefore, I was sitting and I was like, wow, why would someone want to live in the city? And then it didn't help that I was spending my summers on the south side of Chicago and sort of seeing, some of these things, but I didn't know what I was looking at. But after that semester of taking the African American history class, I sort of started to look at it, and it gave me a lens to understand Detroit, Chicago, Memphis, parts of Atlanta. It gave me a context.
Professor Rodriguez, do you remember your first encounter with the Moynihan Report?
Yeah, you had said 50 years, you can't believe it. How do you think I feel? I lived through this. I first read it in the 1980s, and after reading it, I thought, well, what's the big deal? This is what I lived. I come from a family of 8 with a single mother, and I didn't interpret it as demonizing anybody. In fact, my mother at times had the devil in her, so I could totally relate to that. She put the fear of God in us. And I saw no problem with what he had said from my point of view. But I can understand why he said it. And if you had lived through the times, there would be no doubt in your mind why he was saying what he was saying. And let me give you a good example. In 1971, I believe it was, the Bethlehem Globe Times wins the Pulitzer Prize for editorial reporting on race riots in South Bethlehem. They're making national news. And, I could see this, and I also saw and related, in hindsight, of course, that if it hadn't been for my mother, if it hadn't been, and I'm sure maybe we all could have taken the lead and had acted as Moynihan said they were acting. If my mother hadn't been like that, I wouldn't be here. So I took it from a totally different point of view. I would say, well, God bless my mother. I didn't see it or interpret it as anything negative. So I had absolutely no problems. And today I look at it and interpret it in a similar way. I just didn't see it as anything negative. Now, after I've been educated, I can see why people would have problems with it. But even today, from my own experience and what I went through and what I saw back then, I had no problems with it.
Yeah. Mr. Day.
So obviously before my time, but my interest in the Moynihan Report is actually rather recently. But reading on my own free time, I read Freedom Is Not Enough by James Patterson, or The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Very good book. But it really sparked my interest, and I could connect a lot of those issues to current day problems and things that I experienced growing up in poverty, single mother and everything, and all my friends as well. I do think that maybe there was a little overemphasis on connecting it with slavery and the first Jim Crow. though definitely the seed was planted by that. But a lot of people missed out on his point of it's structural in jobs, employment, and everything. And that definitely is going to cause like the tangle pathology, things like that. So that spoke to my interest.
Yeah, so that's a lot for us to sort of unpack for this audience. I certainly want to come back to the structural piece of this because a lot of people interpret the Moynihan Report as only really talking about behavioral practices, pathologies, people behaving badly or not doing what they're supposed to do in terms of family and community, so on and so forth. But there are some structural things that we should talk about, and the structural things have been fairly persistent over the 50 years. But I first want to try to, if we can, settle the gender sort of split here, because the idea that men read the report one way and women read the report another way is completely borne out in the responses to the report, both then and now. So immediately, as soon as the report came out, there were some negative responses by black civil rights leaders saying that it was problematic. They didn't zero in on the gender piece of it, but over the course of time, various scholars, women scholars, black women scholars have really gone hard at the report. And I'm thinking here of Hortense Spillers, who talks about the erasure of gender within the black community as one of the consequences of slavery. And this is a complicated argument that I'm going to really try to summarize quickly for you, but essentially what Professor Spillers does is she looks back at the institution of slavery, looks at how black families were systematically torn apart, looks at how the status of enslaved children followed the mother, so it's kind of a systematic erasure of patriarchy and the role of fathers in families. And one of the conclusions that she draws is that normal sort of white conceptions of gender don't necessarily apply to black families. And so therefore, the Moynihan Report is not, she doesn't necessarily say that it's racist, although I think she does think it's racist, but she says that it's sexist ultimately, right? That it's incapable of handling the complexities of how gender operates in the black community. And so one of the things that's interesting is that, so from your perspective, you're like, the women that I know don't seem to fit into the report. From your perspective, you're like, my mom, the woman that I know, does seem to fit into the report. So I wonder, how do we square that gender divide on the panel about how you received the report? Like, what are your thoughts about some of the gender implications that you're talking about, or the gender implications of the report? And again, this is not just you two. This is how the report was received generally in the moment it was released, but also over time, many scholars have written about the sort of gender divide of the Moynihan Report, which is to say that some folks see the report as blaming women for the pathology and the destruction of the black family, and some folks see the report as, wow, there's all these great superwoman, single black women who try to do all this good stuff, and they're kind of like in some ways superhuman. But that divide, I don't think has been completely settled, and you guys sort of did that for us perfectly here on the panel. Thoughts though about some of the gender issues. Professor Rodriquez, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I don't know that it's gender as much as socioeconomic. If you're from an extremely poor family, gender issues just don't come up. There are more important things to worry about than whether it's a single female household or a single parent. Getting food on the table, and you don't really care how, is far more important. So that hasn't been addressed, the socioeconomic factors. If you come from a black middle class family, you got a lot better than a poor, extremely poor white single parent family, and those things have to be taken into consideration. I don't see that anywhere in there that is a factor in this, and if it's then made into a gender issue and not a socioeconomic issue, then we're talking about different, it's something totally different here. And if we skip over to socioeconomic and concentrate on gender, then we're missing the point. And there's no solution to the problem.
I'm not sure about that, Professor. Two things. One, we have to look at the data on across a range of things before you make a comparison about black middle class families versus poor white families. Yeah, it's difficult to do that.
I mean, I agree in that. I just use that as an example to make a point.
That we're going to get to the socioeconomic piece of it, but and I'm not trying to let gender dominate the discussion either. I just want to make it clear here that the report itself talks about single black mothers as being endemic to the problems that black people will face going forward. And there may be, we do need to look at the socioeconomic factors that underpin that, but I'm saying that the response to the report cut along gender lines because of some of the content that was in it. And it just so happened that you guys, I think, took those sides unknowingly in ways that not necessarily, this is not me critiquing either one of you, by the way. This is to say that that represents how people responded to the report and how people still do respond to it.
And I do think that gender becomes, we can't ignore gender at all in this aspect, because even when you look at this report, there's, because what the underlying argument is that black women, unlike in the majority culture, he called non-whites white, black women, because they are the head of their households and they control their household, not only do they emasculate black men, but in a culture, and he basically explicitly says this, in a culture that the patriarchy is more reverenced, and then to have this culture in which black women are the head of, it creates a subculture that is the root to the pathology. Even just recently, so that's what his major piece is, and that's where the problem is that he's saying that black women, because they have a control of their households, they create a subculture that basically have them in dominance, which is counter to the general culture. And he says, hey, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with a matrilineal society. However, in a general culture that does not reverence that creates a problem. So he does address gender explicitly in the report. And for me, to go back to your question about how did I see, again, because I think when you read things, you want to see yourself, and you could to make it relevant to your aspects, so to your life. And so one of the things that I did notice was that how, again, even as the same age as the audience, the students who are in the audience, I looked at it and I started to look around when they were saying families with limited resources have a tendency to send women to college. And that was his argument, that when it came to non-whites, they'll have a tendency to send females to college. And so I was looking around, because I went to a historically black institution, Tougaloo College, and what happens is I started to look at how many women came to the college in my first year as opposed to men. And we were outnumbering men 3-1. And so therefore I saw myself in the report there. And I also saw there was this extra, like you were talking about, this superwoman aspect. Because in essence, because of the structural inequalities, it's this idea that black women are supposed to sort of shoulder this responsibility, at the same time cater to the egos and the personalities of black men, and then also accommodate, even if we're emasculating them, and at the same time accommodate racism. And let me just tell you an excerpt from that report that I actually liked. And it was just very interesting how he looked at women. In this response. He said, now I don't want you to really pay attention to this, because this really stands out to me. He says that the Negro American has survived at all is extraordinary. The lesser people might have died out, as indeed others have. That the Negro community has not only survived, but in this political generation has entered national affairs as a moderate, humane, and constructive national force is the greatest testament to the healing powers of the democratic ideas and the creative vitality of the Negro people. But may not be supposed that the Negro American community has not paid a fearful price for the incredible mistreatment to which it has been subjected over the past 3 centuries. So in essence, to me, the report, and where I think the gender aspects engage in it because it's a level of contradiction. On one hand, you're saying that the extraordinary feat that black people have survived, this is an extraordinary feat that they have survived in the midst of slavery, in the midst of lynching, in the midst of disfranchisement, in the midst of economic opportunities. And it's the black women, according to you, that's been shouldering the responsibility, but now they're at the center in the thesis of the after blacks get rights, they're the center now of the problem. And so that's where the crux of the gender aspect comes in. And again, when you sort of look at it, it looks as if what he's saying is that give black males an opportunity and let them thrive in this society. And if women could just perhaps, if black women could just perhaps be like white women, then this is the way that we can get over this hump. But the reality is, but you just said that we are able to survive is a testament. So that's where the crux and the rub come in for me.
So we should talk about some of the structural economic issues. And Mr. Day, since you brought them up first, maybe you can talk a little bit to that. I mean, when sometimes people say things like structural inequality or social, what are we talking about specifically when we're thinking about the structural issues and socioeconomic issues that inform the Moynihan Report and also in some ways inform the current moment?
Definitely very broad for the structural issues, but I would imagine at the time, and he kind of emphasizes from the 50s on, it started getting worse, which directly correlates with after World War II and the suburban migration of white people out of cities. And manufacturing started following them to the suburbs as well. So right there, you start having a mass decline in well-paying, low-skilled jobs for the African American community. So right there is where you start having mass unemployment for men, and studies have shown that, of course, poverty really has a burden on marriage, causes conflict in marriage, and eventually divorce, separation, or you're too poor for divorce, so they just separate. And he did address that with deindustrialization of the urban areas. And then, of course, furthermore would be discrimination in the workplace, African males getting paid less than white males, and same thing with African women. I definitely agree with her about it reminds me of the phrase, strong black woman and everything for him to attack that. I'm not going to go it. But anyways, yeah, I mean, that would be the main structural issue of the time, 1965, the deindustrialization of urban areas, causing the high unemployment.
Professor Rodriquez, you want to talk a little bit about some of the socioeconomic factors that inform the report in that contemporary in the contemporary moment?
Do you know what we're doing? What was generally condemned on conservatives here. The report comes to a conclusion. One, the main cause is racism, and the other one is the results of that racism. We're talking about the results. Why don't we talk about the racism?
Let's talk about it.
Right.
Well,
Right.
So I thought so the reason why I went to socioeconomics is because you said there are socioeconomic factors that's not distracted by gender, but now you want to talk about racism. We can talk about racism.
Well, I'm just saying that that's what's always been avoided, and I'm seeing us doing it here as well, right? We're not talking about the root cause of all this, which he pointed out, and scholars since then had focused on the second half. Not the first half, which is the racism, right?
But the racism, and this is what he does in the report for those of you who haven't read it. And I'm moderating 2 other sessions, so I have my intro that I want to use that. But I do want to...
Don't give us too much now.
I'm not going to give you too much now. Hamlet don't hurt. Okay, what happens is that, in order to get to that root, and I do want to go back to something with the gender aspect. One of the things that he said, to give you a real example of how he sort of addressed gender, was that he said that African American males, there was only one place that they actually got a fair chance. and that was the military. Right? That was the one place. He said that if you take an African-American male, and so therefore, this was 65, this is, we're talking about the escalation of Vietnam, there'll be a lot of other aspects there, but he said if you participate, if blacks who participate in the armed forces have a better chance in life, basically, than those who do not. And so he has a whole section on it. And so I go again, going back to this aspect of not looking at some of the root causes. And then he talked about how black women were more likely to go into what he called more middle class sectors, so they were able to, though they had fewer children when they were college educated, they wanted to hit up their resources and divide their resources in various ways. So that said and done, while we are addressing racism, there is one line that is really one of my favorite lines. Well, if I had to choose a line in this report that he says, and I'm going to read, I like to go to the source. He said, and I hope you all can you hear me? Because I can't. Yeah, okay, I thought so. Because I couldn't hear myself. Okay, here it is. Yeah, I sound much better now. Okay, he says, extending the line of reasoning, psychologists point out that slavery in all of its forms sharply lower the need for achievement in slaves. I'm going to pause there because you're talking about the heart of racism. I'm going to say it again. Extending this line of reasoning, psychologists point out that slavery in all of its forms sharply lower the need for achievement in slaves. Negroes in bondage, stripped of their African heritage, were placed in a completely dependent role. All of their rewards came not from individual initiative and enterprise, but from absolute obedience. A situation that severely depresses the need for achievement among people. Now, we're talking about the socioeconomic level. What he's saying here is that, in essence, when you live in a society that can cripple you on various ways, and I can use contemporary examples, but I want to do that later on. I'm going to do it later on in my panel. So what happens is that, but I can use contemporary examples like, for example, well, let me just bring it up just quickly, how people said, if Trayvon would have acted this way, if Mike Brown would have acted this way, if Eric Gardner would have acted this way. So then, therefore, citizenship becomes about not necessarily an inherent right, an inalienable right, but one that's based on performance. And so, therefore, in the report, the reason that people intertwine the two, between the structural and between the cultural, is because, in essence, if you can sanitize this group of people, if you can make them go along with what the status quo is, then their conditions will improve. And so therefore, let's look at how much in comparison, because in the whole, the report has charts comparing non-whites and whites. If they could only just duplicate what whites have done, and if they can only just change their culture, then the things that they identify as racism and bigotry will go away. And that's the simple part of it. And so you cannot divorce structural inequalities from the perception of what people perceive as culture, because the two are intertwined. If they would only, and I say they, I mean blacks or non-whites, if they would only just act a certain way, if they only just pull up their pants, if they only just don't name their names, names like LaTonya and Shaquanda and Laquinka, Wakahika, and if they just change and they keep names, if they play, if they play games instead of basketball, and maybe they need to be introduced to lacrosse. So let's take them into the rural areas and let them pat a sheep, and then they can appreciate life. If we can only just do that to them, they will change. And that's we can't divorce the two.
Yeah, I just want a couple of things, because we have to open this up soon, I'm assuming. So first, Moynihan is wrong about the obedience piece and achievement in slavery. That's just incorrect. I mean, certainly you can look at the system and think that, but there have been so many scholars who have destroyed that thesis that somehow slavery killed the capacity for achievement in the black community. Obviously, it's not true, even contradicted in some ways by what he said. Just to be clear, the things that Mr. Day is talking about, that is structural racism. So if you're talking about black men making less than white men or black women making less than white women, that's structural racism. You know, you talked about the white flight that accompanied deindustrialization. This is a really important piece because the resources to build the suburbs of America are federally subsidized, a lot through mortgage lending. And when you look at the mortgage lending practices, right, again, structural racism. The suburbs are built on structural racism. They're built on lending practices that allow white folks to get loans for homes that did not allow black folks. In fact, this is in the 60s, and it really even extends from Jim Crow. There were a lot of black folks who couldn't even live in certain neighborhoods in the suburbs because of certain structurally racist practices. And so the question is, which racism do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about the historical racism of slavery, institutionalized and chattel bondage and things of that nature? Or do you want to talk about what I refer to more as the structural elements of racism that are more persistent, which is about lending practices, inequality in terms of job pay, and a whole host of things, access to health care, last hired, first fired. There's a whole range of metrics that we can use.
What happens is that in Coates' article, did anyone in the audience or on the panel read A Case for Reparations by Coates?
Yep.
Okay.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yes, and so what happens is he
gives you the full continuous line.
He basically looked at the housing practices in Chicago, which, by the way, my auntie was a victim, my great aunt. Mm-hmm. But what happens is that he looks at the housing practices in Chicago, and he says, okay, this is how people generally build their wealth, but let me show you how the federal government assisted in the marginalization of African Americans, and let me show you how this worked. So in essence, I'm saying that you can't divorce, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but you really can't, because in essence, part of the reason or the very value of the black body comes from the idea that they were chattel slavery. So the black body in itself is stigmatized. So therefore, when people see the black body, let it be for criminal justice, let it be for housing, let it be even inside of a classroom, there is a discourse that goes on there that cannot be just layered away like an onion. It's basically very inextricably intertwined. So therefore, there is no separation. For example, let's just take something like a Trayvon Martin. A Trayvon Martin's body was therefore assembled. George Zimmerman did not know anything about the child per se, but what he knew was what that body represented. And so therefore, that stigmatized body, it represented something just like if you take that same example, what happened in Florida that day, and if you go to any suburbs and someone is walking around at 9 o'clock at night and that neighborhood is not associated with that person living there, that's now a stigmatized, it's the same scenario. And so therefore, I'm saying, I don't know necessarily, the person who applies for a job, there's been reports that show that people who have a name that is a type of a quote-unquote ethnic name, they're least likely to get a call back. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I'm saying that I don't really think that you can divorce the two. You can't necessarily, I don't think an overemphasis on slavery is there. I think in the fact that America does not want to engage in the discourse about slavery. Think about it. We're just getting to this discourse of slavery. What's going to happen when we get to lynching? Okay, what's going to happen when we really start to look at slavery by another name, when we look at this prison industrial complex? Mm-hmm. So therefore, I mean, we're still on elementary stage, basic, which is slavery. Wait till we get through with that, because the idea is that when slavery, and again, slavery in America is really has never been abolished, because what happens is it just changes. But then no, the 13th Amendment says that, slavery, there's an abolishment of slavery except for the punishment of crime. So therefore, with that aspect being there, I don't think that we can separate the two. And I think that's dangerous for us to try to do so. And that's why I just want to halt that discussion.
Definitely. I would say that they try to explain or cover up structural racism with historical racism and everything. It's, you know, African males are prone to violence, prone to crime. That's the reason why we have, you know, disproportionate amount of African Americans in prison and things like that. That's why they're dropping out of school and, you know, not completing college, and, you know, all of those things. They tried to cover up with other racist, you know, explanations.
We need to get ready to open this up, but obviously the panelists could talk about these issues all morning. I'm not sure if there is a mic for the audience, but we can certainly take some questions for, oh, you can come down here to the front. Yes. You can use my mic, Doc.
I think I got it. I'm going to talk just like this, just in case we have any questions.
I have a question about, you mentioned the military. When this was written in 1965, African American men had fought during World War II and Korea, especially like in World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, the Third Army, Patton, and other places too. I just wondered, that must have been a real problem, sadness to fight like that, come back and be included in this report, portrayed as not having availed themselves of the riches of America, you know, and not to mention the suburbs were funded by in many cases, the GI loans.
That's right.
And so.
And black vets didn't get GI loans.
And that, I mean, was there any discussion in the Moynihan Report about that? How they really didn't reap those? My dad got a GI Bill. He used it for the house.
No, what he was saying, and this goes back to the gender argument, and let me just say just quickly, because I am, at Westchester University, we have a statue of Frederick Douglass. And that was built primarily by the contributions of people who were concerned with preserving this idea of legacy. But if you go to the statue, around there are 6 benches. The 5th bench, I like to say, is my bench, because it is, I paid for it. But anyway, what happens is that it says the United States Colored Troops. Now, what happens is, if you're not careful, if you read this report, you would think that maybe black military action sort of started in the 20th century. You wouldn't necessarily know about, you know, blacks fighting in the American Revolution, but then also with this idea of the United States Colored Troops, in the discourse of America, what you have is that they're excluded. Because what Moynihan says is that men can go into the military, he even gives a quote, to be the best man you can be.
That's straight propaganda in the Moynihan Report.
Yeah.
To try to get more black troops into the coffers for the Vietnam War. And there's so much data even by this point that black troops are returning as veterans and they're 2nd, 3rd class citizens. They don't have access to things like the GI Bill. I come from a military family, but the reality is when you look back over the generations, black vets have been really underserved when they retire. But that's propaganda where he's saying,
it's propaganda, and what he's saying though is that he's again, it's a commercial for the military. Let's just say that, but in essence, it's again that slight against black women, because black men cannot be what they need to be in a general society because of structural racism with employment, with housing, and being in the home, then they're been emasculated. But the way that they can become men is if they join the military. And so that's how he sort of addresses that. So he doesn't necessarily, then he gives sort of this very gloss over, because those who serve in the military, they get all of these benefits and they end up living better lives. So you don't necessarily get an interrogation of the structural aspects that you're talking about them not receiving the benefits that they should have. What you get is a commercial for join the military, because that's the best way, that's your best way in society right now, black men, that you can get ahead.
And a lot of black men did.
And even if they did benefit from, say, the GI Bill, due to housing discrimination, they would have had to buy houses in high poverty, black communities. They wouldn't have been able to move to the suburbs, so would have just added to the concentration of poverty and segregation.
You have your hand up, Elaine?
Other questions or comments? We have one right here.
I recently took a poverty class, and this nice pamphlet says that at the time of this report, there was 25% black females, female-headed households. And I know that that number has gone up. And I guess my question is, I honestly did not know anything about this report. This is my first introduction to all of this, all of these concepts. And my question is, are the arguments in this report, are they still being argued today? Does that make sense? Like, I assume the answer is yes, but I was hoping that maybe you guys could elaborate on that a little bit.
They absolutely are. I mean, and this is a bigger debate maybe in the 21st century about the construction of the black family, the behavior of not just black folks, but poor folks. We tend to want to look at the behaviors of poor people as being the root causes for their condition. That's kind of like, that's like an American way of seeing things. In America, we feel like, a lot of people in America feel as if, and the government feels this way, that a lot of times poor folk are poor by choice because they do drugs, or they have drug testing for welfare, right? Or because they are lazy, they don't want to go to work. They listen to the wrong music, they dress the wrong way, they eat the wrong food, et cetera, et cetera. But there are also lots of progressive folks in America who don't believe that, who want to look more at some of the more structural issues that we've been talking about, like thinking about how capitalism works and thinking about the concentration of wealth at the top 1% of the people in the world, really, right? So there are competing frames of reference to think about poverty in America. And yes, I think we are still debating some of those things because a lot of conservative black folks believe that the family structure is at the root of black pathology and black challenges, and don't want to think so much about some of the structural issues of racism in that particular case. But I don't know if any other panelists.
I mean, what was it, 1965, white families were headed by a single female, 3%. Black families were 23%. And today it's about 75% for black families and 25% for white families. To me, what that shows is it's not like, because of slavery and everything, it's a poverty thing, because obviously white people didn't go through slavery or Jim Crow or anything, and now there's 25%, same level as 1965. The reason why black families are so much higher is way before 1965, you had a much longer, extended, and deeper rate of poverty that contributed to breaking up families way before 1965. So I guess you could say they had a head start with poverty, breaking up the families for it. And that goes with structural and racial.
By the way, I'm not absolutely convinced that single mother homes are necessarily the problem or the root cause of poverty. Obviously, if you have a one income earner versus two, you're more likely to be impoverished. But I don't think the cause effect or the reverse of that is necessarily true. Just because you have a married couple, I don't think necessarily means that a family is better off in the ways that people who truck in those arguments want to think.
Yeah, that's why I was emphasizing single parent family and not single mother family, because obviously 2 paychecks are better than 1. The only justification I could see Moynihan making is still to this day you have unequal pay between men and women. So a single father family is going to have a little bit higher income than females. And the only other issue is I can see a teenage male starting to rebel against a single mother a little more than a single father for obvious reasons. But other than that, I agree with what she was saying earlier about the gender issues.
And then we also have to look at, like, right now, just tell you what the stats are. So 72% of African American children are born to households with one parent, okay? So they tell us that stat. So then, if you're not careful, if you don't know how to interrogate, what happens is that, and if you go by the idea that, you know, there's a level of dysfunction in single-parent households, then you'll say, well, if 72% of them are raised in these single-parent households, then that's the reason why their school records look the way that they do. That's the reason that the criminal justice look the way that they do. I mean, now you can start to do causation when it's really not there. It's almost like saying, like, let's give you an example where people say something like, you know, during baseball season, they bring about mosquitoes. So, you know, it's just like, it's not really there. But we also know now that they're talking about 48%, regardless to across the line, nearly 1 out of 2 children that are born to a mother or to a parent, they are in single-parent households first time around. So we get those stats, but we normally get those stats to talk about the, the disintegration of the American family and the American structure. And so in essence, it's still going back to a gender issue, because in essence, if all of these children, if only these women would have more safer practices, then we wouldn't have some of the ills that we have. So to answer your question, in 65, it was a quarter. Now it's roughly 75% of these children. And so now you can sort of look at, you know, the problems that come from this community really go back to the very crux of what he's saying in this report, which is the female and her behavior.
Do we have time for one more? There's one more question in the back. This will be our last question.
I just found it interesting when you were saying the whole stigmatism thing. I wasn't born in a family that put a stigmatism on non-whites, but who's to say if I was? I actually work a serving job, and you know, I don't notice any stigmatisms, you know, at all between, you know, any different races at all, and I just find that interesting. But if I didn't have that non-stigmatism family, and, you know, if I found, you know, an example where, you know, that was not present, where that stigmatism wasn't held, if I would be, you know, reacting the same way. And then the only other thing I was thinking about was was how with jobs and employment, the protected classes, it's hard to say whether if the people are actually like right for the job or not, because you can just say, I don't like this person for that person, and no matter, you know, if white or non-white. It's just so hard to put, even though those classes are protected, that if the really all those ethical concerns that actually has, it just made me think that, you know, it's hard to say with employment that it really puts a burden on everything that you can really portray that. I can't really get to the point.
I got what you're saying.
Yeah, I think
it's hard to stab at.
I mean, I was just going to add one little part. The study that she was talking about earlier is they actually sent out identical resumes to employers. Identical, but they changed the name. One was like John Smith, very white name, and the other one was like Tyrone Williams, Washington or something like that. And by far disproportionately, John Smith got calls, got interviews and things like that.
But also just to clear up, you know, it is we all have like an individual responsibility when it comes to like race and bias or gender and bias. Like we all, as individuals, we should try to think about equality and all that stuff. But the stuff that our panelists are talking about today are like structural things, like systems of oppression, systems of racism. The interpersonal stuff is important, but we're actually talking more about like, you know, systematic ways of denying access to things, whether that's through jobs or through loans. And that's actually related, but quite different from our individual sort of biases and issues with it.
But I do want to say something. The New Jim Crow opens, Michelle Alexander's book opened up with an African American. He's eagle-eyed on the floor, I'm on the ground. She said, I'm coming from this election of the first black president, and people are stepping over, they're going on their way because it is so commonplace to see an African American male eagled on the ground with law enforcement on it. So therefore, I want you to sort of think about, when you think about when people are going into stores like New York because there are protests, or even Forrest Whitaker, you know, this Academy Award-winning actor, he goes into a bodega in New York, and this employee, or this, you know, general employee believes that he can go and quote unquote stop and frisk him before he walks out of the store. And so I say that to say, when you sort of think about certain elements, I like to do this in my students in class. I say, when you say Santa Claus, what's the image? When you say drug dealer, when you say crack queen, when you start saying certain pieces, then what images pop in your head? So therefore, when you see kids, for example, on a bus, coming in tuxedos, coming from an event in Oklahoma, and they're 18 and 19 years old, and they're talking about lynching people in trees, there is a response that they have in their head about what that black body represents, because they say no, you know, no nigger will ever sign with me. Why? Why is that 18 and 19 reveling in that thought? Because somewhere in this society that we live in, someone has stigmatized that individual so much that you have a bus of males and females singing a song that's connecting and building community, and basically stigmatizing that black body, not getting to know the individual, but was saying who and who will not basically work and be in my environment, in my space. So you take that not being recorded, and now you go and they graduate from school and they get an application and it says John Smith, Tyrone Williams, okay, or they get a housing application or a loan application. How does that now translate into public policy? So the stigmatized body is not just in one element on like, let's say on that bus in Oklahoma that day. That is now giving you an indication of where public policy can be, because you cannot divorce that from the individual and how their perception of a body is. You can't divorce that from what their actions can and may be.
Dr. Rodriguez, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say that the racism and privilege to whites is so structured into our society that when you try to rectify it, it looks like you're disadvantaging the people who already had the advantage. So to you, it would seem like a reverse racism because you're used to the way things are. Well, the way things are, for lack of a better word, are unequal and wrong and advantageous to a particular group. And so it would seem then that you're advantaging a protected group, if you will. Well, you're not advantaging, you're just trying to make the playing field level. But the norm is advantageous to a particular group. So that's why it appears to be disadvantage or discriminating against the group who has the majority of the structural power. So that's what makes it seem so difficult, and it is so complex. If it was easy, I think we could solve it already, but it's so ingrained into our system. And you know, I don't want to belabor this, but the people who have my class, I've associated with Christianity, with capitalism. It's just, you know, it's not something that I think we're going to be able to solve anytime soon because it is so structural.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Rodriguez, Mr. Day, and Dr. Thames-Taylor for a brilliant discussion this morning.